Welcome in once again to the most accurate podcast here at 4 for 4 Fantasy Football, the greatest fantasy football podcast in existence right now, I'm pretty sure. My name is Matt Okada. I account for at least 20% of that greatness. The other 80% comes from John Paulson and his excellent analysis. John, how are you doing on this Friday morning for us, noontime for Easterners?
Yeah, many people are saying this is the greatest fantasy football podcast of all time. You can just say things like that now. I'm doing all right. We're week 8? We're almost halfway through the season. That was an entertaining game last night. I'm actually doing pretty well. It's kind of an overcast Friday morning though here in Southern California. So
okay, the overcast has moved its way down to you. That's good.
Yes.
Yeah, we had a lot of fog this morning. Last night the game was played right here next to my home, actually, about 6 minutes from me. The Rams beat the Vikings somewhat confidently, 30-20. Oh my goodness, the difference that a couple of all-pro wide receivers can make to an offense. The Rams obviously had been sputtering for much of the year. They were 1-4 at one point, I think, going into their bye or something like that. After 5 games, regardless. And Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp both returned. Cooper with some expectancy. We were kind of expecting it to happen. Puka Nacua's return was completely out of nowhere. So if you were in the Twitter streets, hopefully you found your favorite analysts and asked them their thoughts. But in fairness, nobody really knew what to expect. There was a potential snap count. Turns out there really was not one. Puka had 9 targets, caught 7 catches for 106 yards. He looked great early and often. Cooper Kupp was also pretty good. 8 targets, 5 catches, 51 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, that touchdown was pretty big for his production. It would have been not quite as good. I think before we hop to anything else, just rest of season between those two guys, now that they're back, assuming they're fully healthy, which it seems more or less they are. Cooper maybe even could get more healthy based off of how he looked. How are you assessing and ranking those two rest of season?
Yeah, I bumped Puka up this morning just based on how he looked last night and how many targets he got just in 57% of the snaps. So his snaps were reduced from last year, 87% last year, 57% this year, or this game. But he had 9 targets and he averaged 9.4 targets per game last season. So what I found early in the draft season was that his splits when Cooper Kupp was active were a lot lower than his splits without, which makes sense. I mean, Cooper Kupp is a target earner and is going to affect the receivers around him. So I think they're both high-end wide receiver 2s. I think it's debatable whether or not one of them is going to be posting wide receiver 1 numbers rest of season if they're both healthy and out there. It just does seem like Matthew Stafford now has a better connection with Puka than he does with Kupp. If anybody looked a little rusty, it was Kupp. And he was supposedly the more healthy of the 2, whereas Puka came in and had 4 catches in the first drive or something. And Matthew Stafford, I think the other beneficiary of all this, and it makes sense that he goes from being a QB 2-3 fringe guy without these guys to possibly low-end QB1, high-end QB2 numbers rest of the season. And the issue with him is he doesn't run the ball at all, so it's all pocket passing basically. But if he has these 2 healthy rest of season, they appear to be going that direction, then his numbers are definitely going to improve, and we saw it last night.
Yeah, 279 yards, 4 touchdowns. He did throw a pick, and the Vikings have been better at that than any other team in the league. Largely have been a good defense, and Stafford looked amazing against them. So maybe, just maybe, with both guys healthy, my old man Stafford and old man Cousins and old man Rodgers thing is finally starting to take shape. Briefly, by the way, we have a question in the chat. Rubio asked, do y'all think Cooper will be traded? This was a big question mark coming right pretty much the days coming into this game. Some news broke that Cooper Kupp might get traded, especially if the Rams lost this game and their season was looking more or less lost. As of now, that looks like it will not be the case. Sean McVay said last night, I'm really glad, quote, I'm really glad to have Cooper Kupp back with us, and I expect it to stay that way. So big win for them. They're 1 game out in the division. Both guys healthy, the offense looking amazing. It seems very likely they'll be sticking together. There was also a brief Stafford rumor from somewhere. I think it was a less reliable source, but that's not happening either, obviously. Elsewhere in the game, Darnold was okay, not amazing. Aaron Jones was pretty solid with 37 receiving yards and 58 rushing yards. Didn't score. Could have been better there, but he's a every week start at this point, I think. Justin Jefferson, 8 catches on 9 targets for 115 yards. At some point early in the first quarter, I think he was on pace for 54 catches. That didn't quite work out. I think he might have had the first 5 touches of the game, or targets at least, but continues to be a stud. No one else there in the receiving core did anything particularly great. That's something we're going to have to expect, I imagine, all season. Inconsistency from Addison, Naylor, and TJ Hockenson, by the way, expected to be back soon. So it's murky after Jefferson. And on the Rams side of the ball, Kyron Williams still a stud, scored another touchdown. And DeMarcus Robinson scored 2. He is apparently better when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are in, which actually really isn't that surprising. The problem is he's not going to get targets to be reliable. This isn't something we can expect. So I think it's really just those guys at the top. Any other major takeaways for you?
Well, Robinson likes the attention being elsewhere, and Stafford likes to target him in the red zone. This went back to last year where he had a touchdown, I think, in the last 4 or 5 straight games as the third receiver in a low volume role for the Rams, and all of a sudden it rears its head again. And he was well ahead of. I wasn't sure this was going to happen because Tutu Atwell had been playing really well, but he's well ahead of Atwell in terms of routes run. He ran the most routes of the 3 of all the receivers for the Rams, 34 routes for Robinson and only 7 for Tutu Atwell. And Atwell is actually outplayed, or at least Tyler Johnson ran more routes, 9 than Tutu Atwell. So he could be dropped probably in most leagues. The other thing I'd mention on the Vikings is that, I think with this sort of good quarterback play that we're getting from Sam Darnold, and we did talk about it being a possibility in the preseason. That's why this is the most accurate podcast. We actually allowed for the possibility that Sam Darnold was going to have a career resurgence. The weird thing about last night is only 25 pass attempts, 22 rush attempts. So they really only, 47 plays. That sort of volume is extremely low for the NFL these days. Usually you're at 58, 62, somewhere in there. So that is part of what drove this really ugly box score. Plus you get your touchdowns to Josh Oliver and Trent Sherfield, and nothing's going to look real good for the Vikings in terms of the receiving other than Justin Jefferson. But Aaron Jones, 3.1 yards per carry. I was expecting a better day rushing for him. The Rams rushing defense has not been particularly good, but they did a pretty good job last night.
Jordan Addison did run the second most routes on the team, 26. Jefferson ran 28. So you can't expect that if and when the targets go up because the passing attempts go up, Addison would be the beneficiary. But again, Hockenson coming back. And in fact, we can just sort of get towards the news with that. He is expected to be back next week, week 9. He'll be activated and play is the reports right now. So with him back now, I mean, this is great news for Sam Darnold and should be continually started, it seems like. But that's going to take, that boost in targets you might get for more pass attempts for Addison. Some of those are going to go to TJ Hockenson. Just off the, I would say off the top of your head, but you have your ranking, so it's never off the top of your head. Hockenson rest of season tight end ranking. How quickly does he get up into that elite area where he was previously?
I mean, it could be pretty quick. I have him at tight end 9, so he's ahead of Kyle Pitts and Mark Andrews and Sam Laporta right now, and just below Ferguson and Ingram. He's probably on that tier, a big tier with Kraft, Njoku, Ferguson, Ingram, Hockenson, and Pitts. And then Sam Laporta could jump back in if he can do something in the next couple of games with Jameis and Williams sideline and kind of reestablish himself in the offense. But fairly bullish on Hockenson, big target earner when he's healthy. We have not seen him with Sam Darnold, so this may not be the same connection that we saw with Cousins. But Darnold has been playing really well, so I would expect him, expect the offense to kind of run through Jefferson and Hockenson with Addison getting some work as well.
All right, that'll be a fun ad because goodness, do we need some strong tight end play? Other news. Well, before we get to other news, just a reminder for questions and answers. We will do the Q&A at the end of the show, so be dropping those questions in. You can start dropping them in now. Simple 1v1 start sit questions. You can go to 4for4.com, check out John's rankings, and get your answer that way very easily. For the show, for the questions and answers here, try to ask bigger, longer, broader rest of season trade questions, anything like that, stuff that is more difficult, more complex, because that's what we like to get into, dig our teeth into. Okay. Some general news across the league. DeAndre Hopkins got traded to the Kansas City Chiefs. This feels like it didn't get as much hoopla as I would expect for those two names, but I think that largely probably comes from DeAndre Hopkins dealing with injury, older, we'll say, not obviously performing well in Tennessee. Now you can say how much of that comes from Tennessee. Look at the Amari Cooper situation. How similar is it to that? What's your takeaway here in terms of fallout for him, for Kansas City, and then also for Calvin Ridley, if you care at all?
Yeah, this just happened Wednesday morning, and it took me like a half hour to discover that he had been traded. I mean, it was nothing going on Twitter, and then I went over to Roto World just to kind of catch up on the news, and all of a sudden it's like DeAndre Hopkins has been traded to the Chiefs. It's like, maybe more fanfare. I don't know. Definitely a huge bump for him. I mean, he's not top 12 type player anymore, but he'd been kind of languishing in the 40 to 55 range of our weekly rankings and rest of season rankings, just because of the quarterback situation there. Also, limited targets, limited just quality of targets as well in Tennessee. So he gets a bump up to wide receiver 29, I think, or wide receiver 30. So I've got him as a solid wide receiver 3 now, and I think that's sort of flourish if he stays healthy. There is some injury concern baked in with him because he's older and he does have a tendency to pick up, soft tissue, knee injury type stuff. So I do think it's a great fit. I think he can play that big slot role if they want him to fill those Rashee Rice routes, and he can run them. I don't think he's washed at all. I think he could still perform at a pretty high level. Just the question is his health and can he stay on the field? So I don't know about this week. It's a must start, but I think, in the next month or next 3 weeks, he'll be turning into a, solid wide receiver 2 in the rankings, depending on that volume.
Worth noting, Andy.
You wanted me to comment on Calvin Ridley?
Yeah, if you care.
He's more. Well, I've got him in Scott Fishbowl sitting on my bench, staring at me every week. Supposed wide receiver 1 for the Titans, right? He should see lots of targets. Like he really should see at least 8 targets per game. That doesn't mean anything necessarily with the quarterback situation there, but I think you could safely say that he's going to be this focus of the passing game, and he will be, I think, startable as the season wears on, depending on the matchup.
Yeah, he specifically had 8 targets a couple weeks ago with literally 0 catches. So it's one of the toughest situations to translate targets into fantasy value. But to your point, as far as involvement goes, there's not going to be many who have to carry more load at the receiver position rest of the season. It's just quality of that load is questionable. Worth noting on Hopkins, Andy Reid said in a presser that he very much intends for Hopkins to fit that Rice / even Juju he mentioned role. So that's good, obviously, for DeAndre. And also he should be playing this week. So, to John's point, maybe not a stud out the gate. Are you playing him out the gate as like a wide receiver 3 in his first week in this offense? We saw Cooper and Devontae both be kind of in their first week. Cooper scored a touchdown.
Yeah, Cooper ended up at 50 yards and a touchdown, which is, I have him at wide receiver 48 right now, and I'm sort of waiting to hear, he's going to play, X number of snaps, or they're going to, he'll be a part-time player. It's just hard to trust any player who's playing 50% of the snaps. Puka is the exception, not the rule with that.
One other actually question, a bit of fallout here, because I feel like it continues to go underreported, except in the deep fantasy streets, how bad Patrick Mahomes has been for fantasy. how completely useless, literally useless he has been. Should have been dropped in every league, but mostly wasn't because of the name Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah.
Is this enough, do you think, adding an all-pro receiver to make a difference to that? Or is he still going to be a 13 to 14 point a game low-end QB2 that he's been?
Yeah, I drafted Patrick Mahomes in my main event league with Connor, which I'm fond of talking about this league on the podcast, and it's been an abject disaster in terms of value at the position. I mean, you think you're getting Patrick Mahomes, but you're getting Patrick Mahomes. I don't know. It's like he's capable of 3 touchdowns every week. It just doesn't seem like it's ever happening. Their defense is really good, so they're kind of winning some lower scoring games. So like I still think he's rest of season high end QB2, low end QB1. I think this whole, I mean, you're probably starting other players over him, or you want to until you start seeing more. But he's like the best quarterback or one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and that he's going to have some big games. He can also run the ball. And I think these injuries have had an impact on him. Rashee Rice getting injured after a really hot start, even Juju Smith-Schuster losing him immediately after he, kind of came onto the scene. Travis Kelce's play has declined a bit. But, there are going to be some games here where he's going to be forced to do more than just hand the ball off or, check it down. I still think rest of season is somewhat optimistic because of the talent. And I think the Hopkins addition certainly helps.
All righty. The probably biggest fantasy news of the week, which I dropped below DeAndre because that one is more interesting to talk about. Well, I guess the fallout is interesting here. Brandon Aiyuk and Chris Godwin out for the year. It's also older news because it came from the end of last week, really. But in case you hadn't heard, Aiyuk and Godwin both out for the year. Also, Mike Evans is out for what sounds like about a month, 4 weeks, with a hamstring injury, likely through the Buccaneers bye, which is in week 11. Obviously, we're entering week 8 right now. Really tough. More tough, honestly, for Godwin because Aiyuk had been not very good for fantasy, but Godwin had been amazing. One of the best receivers, not only in all of fantasy, but in the NFL this year, and certainly one of the best values. No more Chris Godwin, no Evans for the next month. The who is up next conversation in both of these receiving groups has been one of the most interesting of the past week. So where are you at? Let's say 49ers first, then Bucks. Where are you at on each right now, and how much room is there for that to shift in the coming days? Also, Juwan Jennings dealing with an injury.
Yes, he's a hip injury. Just to jump back to Patrick Mahomes for a second, wide receiver 22 on the season, wide receiver 25 per game. I didn't realize it was quite that bad. I hadn't looked at
It's really bad.
It's really bad.
He's not been good.
Well, I hope he does better the rest of the season, for my own sake and for everyone who drafted him. Yes, so let's tackle the Bucks first.
Okay.
Chris Godwin, one of my favorites, receivers in terms of just talent, watching him play, really good route runner. Matt Harmon has charted him really high for years, and it was great to see him go back to the slot and really emerge as a top 5 fantasy receiver again. So the loss really stings. Obviously, it's going to sting Baker Mayfield. I'm interested to see what sort of numbers Baker is able to put up in the next 4 weeks with Evans out and Godwin out. And when I pulled up his numbers, what I like to do, with the things like this happen, and I'm trying to project the yards per attempt for a quarterback when they lose their star receivers. I like to pull up their, year-to-date numbers and look at the yards per attempt to all the other players on the field, removing Evans and Godwin. And it's not really fair because the fact that those other 2 players are on the field makes it easier to complete passes to these players, the secondary players. But Baker, 7.9 yards per attempt to all receivers, 7.45 yards per attempt to all other receivers besides Godwin and Evans. So there is it's not like 6.2 or something and really dire. There is a ray of hope that he can keep it up or keep it going. I don't think he nearly has the ceiling that he did before these injuries. When it comes to, Jalen McMillan is the one that got most of the hype this week in terms of, who you should spend your fab on. You and I went back and forth about him versus Cedric Tillman, which is another interesting situation there in Cleveland. And really, is there a huge difference? I don't know. McMillan had 8 targets. That's really the thing that you're kind of focused on in the last game. He only caught 3, I think. But a lot of offseason positivity from the coaching staff there. He had a really good camp, and he came into the season as the 3rd receiver snap-wise. He just wasn't getting much work with Godwin and Evans and Otten and Rashad White, soaking up most of the targets there. So he steps into the number 1 role, I think, in the short term, but probably number 2 or 3 role long term. Sterling Shepard is a known target earner, from his days with the Giants. He's a little older. Would it be shocking if Shepard leads the team in targets this week? I wouldn't be shocked at all. And then Trey Palmer would be the 3rd receiver, and he's had a few games here and there in his young career, touchdown, 40 yards in a touchdown type games, had several starts. Nothing too explosive or any really, really big games, but he might surprise as well. And so I think the only person that I can really bank on is Cade Otton. And, even that's maybe a little dicey. Just we've seen him kind of come in and out of the offense, but he had that huge game with this Godwin injury, but that was late in the game. But the Evans injury was early in the game. He had a huge game and has been a pretty consistent target earner for the last month or so. So I think at a position that we're really dying for production, Cade Otton looks pretty strong rest of the season.
Did you mention him in that tier where you said Hockenson might fall, or is he behind that tier?
He would have been behind that tier, but I think, you can make a case that he should be, low end tight end 1, high end tight end 2 rest of season. He was right under Cole Kmet. So I think you could probably argue that Otton could be ahead of Laporta at this point, or Mark Andrews. Although Mark Andrews has gotten things going in the last couple games.
True.
And then you want to talk about the 49ers. Brandon Aiyuk had a really rough season. I was hoping that he would get things turned around. Really good player. And with him out, it looks like Deebo's back from pneumonia. It was going to be crazy if Deebo couldn't play this week with Juwan Jennings and Aiyuk out and Deebo out. It would have been like Brock Purdy's looking around going, who are these guys? Ricky Pearsall is the name that jumped out. Now he's healthy. Whenever I don't know who a receiver is or how good they are, I go to Reception Perception and check out Matt Harmon's write-ups. Loved Pearsall coming out. It was one of the biggest surprises in terms of the route running charting that he did in college for this draft class. So there's always, whenever there's that sort of love over at Reception Perception, I always put an asterisk by the guy's name and keep an eye on him, because if that player gets opportunity, they tend to deliver because he can get open. So I think in the short term with Juwan Jennings sidelined, and I think that Jennings is I picked him up in my other FFPC league. I think he's a really good rest of season play, given how well he was doing prior to the injury, even with Aiyuk healthy at some times, but with Aiyuk out and Jennings probably in that number 2 role, because he's a really good run blocker. So he's going to be on the field a lot. I think Jennings is a rest of season pickup for sure. But in the short term, with Jennings kind of out, or gimpy, Pearsall, of all these other guys, Ronnie Bell, Chris Conley, Jacob Cowing maybe has some upside, but Pearsall seems to have the most upside of that group. And I wouldn't be surprised if he has a pretty good game this week alongside Samuel coming back from pneumonia, George Kittle with the foot injury. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Pearsall puts up a good number.
Yeah, they're unbelievably banged up. I feel like of the major fallout questions and answers that were had about these two teams this week, Pearsall might have gotten the least hype relative to what I would expect, given the fact he was just a first-round pick. They obviously see him as very, very talented. I think he's a very good fit for this system. So, and we have not gotten to see anything of him because obviously he missed the first couple months of the season coming off that gunshot wound, which was crazy that he's back now. That one is tough to predict because we've seen so little, literally nothing except this past week when I believe he had 5 targets. But maybe the highest upside, because if he pans out as they expect him to when they spent a first-round pick on him and has the kind of target share he could have with no one else healthy, that could be a very, very high upside play. So I like him. I will also note quickly on the Cade Otton situation. On the season, he has the 3rd most targets on the team with 41, pretty much right behind Mike Evans with 45. Actually had one more catch than Evans. Granted, that was very much helped by last week when Evans went out and Otton had a big game. The main thing there is touchdowns. Godwin and Evans have had 5 and 6 touchdowns, respectively. That's 11 of Baker Mayfield's 18 on the season. Cade Otton has only had 1. So the real big question mark here for Baker and the whole team is, does Baker continue to throw touchdowns at a very high level, aka one of the best levels in the league, and just finds other people to do it to, and is therefore still good for fantasy himself? And if so, Cade Otton feels like a very good bet to catch a lot of those. Or does losing 2 of the best receivers in the league, including one of, if not the best consistent touchdown scorers in the NFL, and Mike Evans, just really, really hurt Baker Mayfield, and he falls off and the team's not scoring as much? Tough to know without seeing this play out, so we'll have to pay attention over the next week or two. But big room for benefit and upside for a couple of these guys we've talked about, obviously losing such big names. Hopefully we get Evans back before the fantasy playoffs and he's great again. Okay, that was a lot, but it is the big conversation of the week. Couple other things before we get to injury stuff. Tua Tagovailoa is back at practice. He is expected to return in week 8 from obviously the concussion. Tyreek Hill, there's been a lot of videos and hype on the Twitter streets about how excited Tyreek Hill is to have him back. Immediately, back at practice, making a huge difference to the offense, if you ask Tyreek, or I assume anyone there. Let's just hope and pray and assume that Tua will be healthy rest of the season. Worth noting, by the way, he is refusing, I don't know if that's the right word, it seems a little judgmental, to wear the Guardian cap that more and more players are adding now, which is believed to potentially have some additional protection against concussions. Says it's his personal choice. We'll let him have his personal choice, but just that worth noting. Assuming he's good, rest of season value, after everybody has held on to, hopefully, or traded for maybe at a low price, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, what are your expectations? Do they go right back to where they should have been before?
Yeah, I think so. I just pulled up, Tua played 1 full game, week 1 against Jacksonville, 7 for 100 something and a touchdown for Tyreek. I pulled up Jalen Waddle, 5 for 109 on 5 targets.
Man.
So, I think everything was pointing in that direction. The game 2 against Buffalo was a little tougher. The numbers were, worse. But Buffalo's pretty good against the pass, and Tua was out of that game after 72% of the snaps. So really can't use that as too much of a data point. I think you're sort of back to where we were preseason with this. And, it's a little bit with Tua, it's one hit and he could be out again. And, so if I were to acquire him or pick him up, I'd want to have another quarterback just that's decent to sort of play the matchups or have somebody in case he is injured again. I've got him at quarterback 20 right now, but if he looks like he's going to play this week, which it does, he probably should be up a little bit higher. There's an actual pretty good, it's a pretty good season for fantasy quarterbacks if you look down the list. And maybe Patrick Mahomes should be much lower, calling back to our previous conversation. So yeah, I think you get into Tyreek, he's going to be a rest of season wide receiver 1. I've got him at wide receiver 8 right now, right behind Neighbors and Drake London. One good game out of him, and he's probably back in the top 5, looking normal. And then I'm trying to locate Waddle here. I've got him at wide receiver 28. Probably should be a little bit higher there as well. Chris Olave, George Pickens, Deontay Johnson ahead of him. I think Waddle with Tua probably feels a little more safe than some of those guys. So, looking forward to Achane, seeing him in this offense with a competent quarterback. And even Raheem Mostert, does he get back to 10 to 12 carries for 50, 60 yards and a touchdown like he pretty much averaged last year?
Yeah, whole offense expected to take a major bump here. just I'm curious here, and I think a lot of people might be in a similar boat. Someone else has got Tyreek Hill. Maybe they have uh, a losing record after missing him all this time, and they're looking to make some changes. You have, let's say, Drake London or Jayden Reed, someone in that range who's been playing well. Are you going to try to trade them for Tyreek Hill, given all the, the risk of Tua, but the upside of Tyreek?
Yeah, I mean, I have Jayden Reed at wide receiver 9 and London at wide receiver 7, Hill at 8. So that's right. That's the
Okay.
type of group. Terry McLaurin, those types of players. And there's a little bit of a drop off there after that. I mean, I think you look at Hill as possibly a league winner down the stretch if Tua and Hill stay healthy. And I probably would bank on that more than Jayden Reed keeping up what I love Jayden Reed, but he's not Tyreek Hill yet in terms of average fantasy production, and doesn't have that, like, every week we know he's going to get 7 to 12 targets every week like Tyreek Hill will from Tua Tagovailoa. So London, yeah, I think as well. I mean, their schedules are about the same. I probably have more confidence in Tyreek Hill rest of season, assuming health, than I
Yeah.
do Drake London. But that's actually not a bad idea to sort of float that to see if those fantasy managers might want to cut bait with Hill after a tough start to the season.
Couple really last bit of news here because we already mentioned TJ Hockenson. Jameis Winston will be starting this week at quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. Deshaun Watson out for the year. Dorian Thompson-Robinson was the first guy in last week when Watson got hurt, but he was very bad, and so they made the move to their third emergency quarterback, which was Jameis Winston, and that was the first week that was the order of the depth chart in the first place. Obviously, we've had a long history with Jameis being productive for fantasy purposes, especially for his pass catchers. Main issue is he doesn't really have any pass catchers, but this should make an impact on the offense. Nick Chubb is also back, and Kevin Stefanski has handed over play calling duties to Ken Dorsey, which is interesting, starting this week. So while there is very little, if any, star power left here after Amari Cooper left, do you find any fantasy fallout excitement here in what's left in Cleveland with Winston at quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, I think just from a pure passing standpoint, Jameis Winston is significantly better than current era Deshaun Watson. Certainly better than Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I don't know what's going to happen when he's healthy, DTR, because it looked like they chose him over Winston last week as the backup, which was odd to me. But Winston has a career 7.7 yards per attempt, which is above average. His last 3 starts, it looks like they were in New Orleans. He averaged 286 yards passing per game. So his issue throughout his career is that he throws interceptions, too many of them. Interception percentage of 3.4%, but he also throws touchdowns, 4.9%. And I meant to look it up, but I was trying to figure out when his LASIK surgery was, because there's always these shots of him squinting at the scoreboard trying to read things. And I think that for a quarterback more than any other position, it's good to be able to see crystal clear your receiver when they are running down the field through a secondary filled with other players. But I think I don't know if his interception percentage dropped at all after his LASIK, but he had 3 in 7 games in 2021, 5 interceptions in 3 games in 2022. Probably going to throw a pick, maybe 2 in a week. He's kind of a gunslinger. He can run a little bit as well, and still fairly young, 31-ish, 30-ish. I think this is could be a big boost to the Cleveland offense. He's got Jerry Jeudy, who's a solid wide receiver 2 type. Elijah Moore, solid wide receiver 3 type. I don't know if Cedric Tillman, is going to turn into an alpha or whatever, but he had a good game last week. Most of that was from DTR, but a couple of passes were from Jameis. So Njoku is probably the big winner here, where again at a tight end position we've been struggling to find production. He seems like he's going to have a rock solid floor in terms of targets per game. So I'm fairly excited to see Jameis back in a starting role, and just, it's been a long season for Browns fans, and I'm sure some of them have been wanting them to make this quarterback change for a while, and now they finally get to see it in action.
David Njoku or TJ Hockenson rest of season?
We're right now in Njoku.
Okay.
But I mean, there's kind of same tier that things could change if suddenly we see, Winston doesn't want to throw it in Njoku as much as the other quarterbacks do. Things could change pretty quickly there.
All righty. We will get into the injuries. Before we do that, we actually have a sponsor for today's show. So, John, take it away.
I'm not sure this is my first ad read ever, but it's one of the first, so bear with me. Hey everyone, John Paulson here. We know there are a ton of options out there for real money sports action, but we have found one that really stands out from the rest, Prize Picks. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to everyone. It's so easy to play, and now you can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as few as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy. They call it the reboot. So your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If you sign up today, you will get $50 instantly when you play $5, and that $50 bonus is guaranteed whether you win or not. Prize Picks is the best way to win real money this football season. Which players are going off, which ones aren't. Make sure your picks in less than 60 seconds and turn your sports opinions into real money all season long on Prize Picks. You can even use my projections if you want over at 4for4. One pick that I like, I play Prize Picks every week. So one pick I like this week is Saquon Barkley, more than 81.5 rushing yards. He has beat this number in 5 of 6 games this year, and the Bengals D has given up the second most EPA per rush this season. I have Barkley projected for 99 rushing yards in this game. The other pick I like, George Pickens, more than 61.5 receiving yards. He's an official sneaky start this week. I got in on this earlier this week at 58.5, but I still think it's a good pick. He immediately showed good rapport with Russell Wilson in Wilson's first start, catching 5 of 9 targets for 111 yards in a very bad matchup against the Jets. He'll likely be shadowed by Deontay Banks, and quarterbacks have had a 132 passer rating when targeting Banks this season. I have Pickens projected for around 70 yards receiving, but that might be a tad low. So download the app today and use code TMAP, TMAP, the most accurate podcast, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, just download the Prize Picks app and use the promo code TMAP, TMAP, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game.
Sweet. All right, let's get into some injury news. Updates heading into week 8. Deebo Samuel, who has both been dealing with a wrist injury, but also more importantly, was hospitalized with pneumonia last week. Limited in practice yesterday. His week 8 status is very much up in the air. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that. It's leaning, from what I've seen, towards a no, but I think they're still optimistic that he can get better and good to go. So just keep your ear to the ground there. And then Juwan Jennings seems most likely to be out with that hip injury. So we hit on the 49ers above. Obviously, we're going to be very interested to see who gets the targets and how things go. George Kittle's also banged up, but he's kind of always banged up. It's really Ricky Pearsall, and we'll see what else. DK Metcalf is week to week with a knee injury that he suffered last week on that odd jumping, falling reception play. He seems likely to miss at least week 8, maybe more, but should be out this week. For as long as Metcalf is out, let's just assume for now it's just this week. Is Tyler Lockett a definite play? Is Jackson Smith and Jigba a definite play? Are you kind of iffy on both? Noah Fant, any interest in that Seahawks passing group?
Yeah, I mean, it would be better if they didn't play the Bills this week. It's probably going to be a Kenneth Walker run the ball over and over again week, but they're going to have to throw a bit. I have them both ranked like wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3s, which is higher than, what it would be if Metcalf was in the lineup. So I think they're certainly more playable. I'm going to start JSN in one of my leagues due to the options I have, but I think, fairly confident low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3 if Metcalf sits. And for what it's worth, I do have Deebo in the in the rankings, it did seem like he was back at practice and quote looking like himself. So I put him back in. We'll see if he's able to be active this week. I'm sure they need him desperately.
Yes, they do. Jayden Daniels, with the ribs injury that he suffered last week, is not practicing yet, at least through Thursday. They are hoping to get a practice in today, but he's looking rather doubtful. So obviously that's very unfortunate for anyone who had Daniels, who's been an unbelievably good QB1. Anyone who has Terry McLaurin, this isn't great. Marcus Mariota is the backup there, so you could do worse, I suppose. How much does this affect McLaurin for you, and does it affect anybody else?
Yeah, McLaurin was getting into. I mean, I didn't think that Daniels was going to play this week, just based on the injury and everything kind of around it, and certainly with 3 DNPs, looking very doubtful to me that he'll play. McLaurin has been creeping into low end wide receiver 1, high end wide receiver 2 territory, and right now I have him at wide receiver 24. On top of it, it's a bad matchup against the Bears. They're 4th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. So just not a good confluence of events here for Terry McLaurin.
Yeah, hopefully Jayden gets better soon, because obviously Rookie of the Year candidate, offense working great. We'd like to see him back. Zay Flowers, 2 straight DNPs Wednesday and Thursday with an ankle injury, which he also suffered last week. That's not looking particularly great either, but another one to keep your eye on, especially today's practice report and the final injury report. If he is out, Rashad Bateman has been flashing of late. Very hard to trust him, because it feels like every time he flashes once, he then disappears for 8 games. But if Zay Flowers is out, or even maybe if not, what's your temperature on Rashad Bateman?
Yeah, update for today. Zay Flowers back at practice today, so we'll see what he's listed as. I'm guessing it's going to be a limited and a questionable. Shout out to Jeff Mueller, though, for identifying what he thought was a high ankle sprain, or at least a pretty significant ankle sprain in that game, and saying that he probably wasn't going to practice and might be out this week. Bateman, if Flowers is out, Bateman is a sneaky start. If Flowers plays, then he's really dicey, because Bateman's really dicey because he pops his head up like whack-a-mole, and you're trying to time it right to play him when he's going to have a good game. Flowers, I'd be sort of reluctant to use even if he's active, just due to the injury and him not being 100%. But, wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 type, probably based on his earlier volume and kind of discounting it a little bit. And you're hoping that some of those targets gets taken, or at least I'm hoping that some of those targets get picked up by Mr. Mark Andrews, who has now sort of semi reestablished himself as a tight end 1, but we'll see how things go the rest of the season. He's still sort of seeing limited snaps and limited routes compared to last year, which is a little bit concerning. But that Ravens offense, wow, it's on fire.
Andrews has largely been back in our good graces on touchdowns. I like to see him get a nice 8 catch, 70-yard day to feel really good, but at least he's scoring fantasy points. Jonathan Taylor is a full practice with the ankle injury that has kept him out for a few weeks now, so he should be back. Another one to keep an eye on the final injury report, but full practice improvement through the week means good signs. He should be back. So if you were trying to rely or figure out between Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson, I think we can stop doing that, thank goodness. Chris Olave, full practice on Thursday, so he should also be back from the concussion. That's another big one, obviously. No Rashid Shaheed, so this will be Olave was out when Shaheed was out, so this will be Olave's first game without Shaheed. Could be pretty big for his target share moving forward. He obviously wasn't quite the superstar many people had drafted him to be. Just your general expectation with Shaheed out, how much of a difference does that make for Olave? How high does he climb rest of the season for you?
Yeah, on Taylor, I put him back in the projections yesterday. He's coming in a little lower than I had expected initially, so we'll see if he's full again tonight or today, and what sort of workload they're expecting. But obviously, you can put Trey Sermon and Goodson on the bench. As for Olave, I would be very reluctant to use him this week with Spencer Rattler at quarterback. I kind of want to wait for Derek Carr to get back. before sort of unleashing Olave, but you might have to play him in certain leagues just based on your situation because he is the de facto wide receiver 1 for them. But who knows who Rattler's going to target and whether or not he's going to be on target with any of his passes. So I would probably avoid him this week if possible.
Last bit, Bucky Irving is trending the right direction right now with a turf toe injury. Still a little up in the air, and it had not looked this good earlier in the week. So improvement, but still questionable. They were sometimes when a coach says, "Oh, we're going to ride the hot hand," it doesn't necessarily really mean that. They really seem to mean it in Tampa Bay, mixing up the touches early in the game, figuring out who's going to play well, and then going that direction. So, do you feel confident about anybody either direction in terms of the Irving injury? He plays, you play 2 guys. He doesn't play, you play no one. What's your confidence level?
Well, Atlanta's 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back, so it's a bad matchup. The player that sort of sticks up for me with given that is Rachaad White, just because of his usage as a receiver. I mean, he had 6 catches after the Evans injury, and one would think that he'd be one of the primary targets in the passing game for Baker Mayfield. 2 touchdowns in that game too. Like, he's coming off that injury and ends up with a monster game in a game where we thought he'd be rotating series with Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker. And this Irving, for those of us who have Sean Tucker and Scott Fishbowl, and we're hoping for at least backup RB numbers plus a bunch of kickoff returns, the Irving, we're watching the Irving injury very closely. Would love to have another monster game out of Tucker after we got a 50 burger or whatever it was 2 weeks ago. Tucker would be usable if Irving were out, but it's not a great matchup. I mean, the Falcons are pretty good against the position, but they would probably split touches between White and Tucker in that scenario, maybe favoring White a little bit.
Tucker is currently in my Scott Fishbowl starting lineup, so
as he is in mine.
Yep. If Irving's back, he might be coming out for Ray McLeod or Kavontae Turpin or somebody of that nature. This is the world we live in the Scott Fishbowl. All right. Let's get into some key matchups, the positional matchups, and then we will get to Q&A after that. So continue dropping your questions in chat if you've got them. Game of the week, I am painting the Packers and Jaguars as the game of the week. 49.5 point over-under. The Jaguars are the defense to target of 2024 at pretty much every position. In adjusted fantasy points allowed, they are 32nd against quarterbacks, 32nd against wide receivers, 31st against tight ends, and 25th against running backs. There are 32 teams in the NFL, in case you forgot. So that's very bad for them, very good for us. One of the main reasons I want to include this is almost all the Packers receivers, it seems, are banged up or limited, have some injury designation next to their name. But both with that in mind, but also just generally speaking, where are you at now halfway into the season on the expectations for that confusing conglomerate of talented young receivers?
Well, I think it's been good from the standpoint that we can probably bank on Jayden Reed on a weekly basis. Now, he's got this ankle injury. It was limited Wednesday and Thursday, but he's been playing through it. I think, he's going to have a quiet game here and there because it is a talented receiving core where Jordan Love can really kind of take what's ever given to him by the defense. And sometimes that's going to be people other than Reed. But I think he's your most trustworthy. As far as who's playing well right now, Romeo Doubs has done really good since he's come back from his 1-game suspension for not being involved enough in the offense. He had 3 for 49 and 2 touchdowns and 8 for 94 in back-to-back games on 14 total targets. He has 50-plus yards and or a touchdown in 4 of his 6 games. And then Dontavian Wicks to me is the number 3, although Christian Watson in any given week, if they hit a bomb or 2 to him, could win your week for you. The problem is if, he's a low volume, high ADOT player, they're not giving him any carries like they did last season. So his touches are just extremely limited. All that running work has gone to Jayden Reed, basically, the wide receiver rushing. So you're just hoping for a bomb, and you could get a bomb in this one against Jacksonville. I'm sure they'll look for one. He said that he goes, I knew it was going to be a touchdown on that one play. It was a couple weeks ago when they just called the play in the huddle. And he's like, I know I'm scoring on this, and he ended up getting a touchdown. Like, he's the fastest player on the field, and they do like to stretch the field with him. But if he doesn't catch one of those, then he's only seeing a handful of targets a game because of the talent in this. But Dontavian Wicks came back, had a good touchdown, had a good game, played almost as many snaps. And the interesting thing about Wicks, he's seen a target on 28.2% of his routes, which is really high, and it leads the team. I think Reed is at about 20%. So when he's out there, Love is looking for him, or they are designing plays to get Wicks the ball. He's had some drops, but those are the top three to me. And then Watson as a 4 and Bo Melton as a 5. But Watson in any given week could have the best fantasy day if he catches a long one. It's just tough. Those are tough to predict.
Another interesting bit of stuff to watch here, although we may not get to watch how it actually plays out, because Travis Etienne is a game time decision. He's been dealing with, I believe it's a hamstring injury. Yes, hamstring injury. But even when healthy, it seems like Tank Bigsby has worked himself into a very significant role in this offense, maybe above Etienne. So if Etienne plays this week, if and when he's back, have they become equal for you? Do you still hold Etienne ahead of Bigsby? Has it swapped yet?
Tank Bigsby is tough. I mean, another player that Connor and I have as one of our running back. He's our RB1 right now in the FFPC league with Isaiah Pacheco on the shelf. I mean, you just look at his game log, and this is the story it's telling. 13 for 101. Oh, he had 7 for 90 against Houston, then 13 for 101 on 2 touchdowns with a 28-yard catch against Indianapolis. 7 for 24 against Chicago in a game where Etienne was out, and he ended up getting outplayed by Dearness Johnson. And then last week, 26 for 118 and 2 touchdowns in London, no catches. He had a target and just dropped. He's so bad in the passing game as a receiver that this is the concern. So now the Packers come to town. If they fall behind, you might not see much Tank Bigsby running the ball, and you might end up with another 7 for 24 game like he had against Chicago. So he's really dicey to me. The Packers could go and not play particularly well. This game could be close into the third quarter, and they could be running Bigsby and having success, and he could have a good game. But this is like thin ice type stuff, and especially if Etienne is active, that they want to get him a few touches, and he's involved. Either he or Dearness Johnson's handling all the receiving work. Then that floor is just not there for Bigsby. But he certainly, based on what we've seen, has that ceiling. I mean, he's got 2 games with 100-plus yards and 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games. And then if you go 4 games back, he had 90 yards on 7 carries. Like, he's playing awesome, except for this, situation where they fall behind and game scripts against him, and then they're just not going to run him. They're not going to have him out there because he can't catch the ball.
Brian Thomas is a must start. Christian Kirk seems not as good with Evan Ingram back. Evan Ingram is probably a start if you've been holding on to him and he's your best tight end.
Yeah,
all right,
for sure.
Yeah, okay. Fade of the week, Giants at Steelers. There actually is not a completely horrible game this week, which is rare, I feel like, because there are still some fantasy players you're interested in this game. The Tyrone Tracy Jr. versus Devin Singletary situation is interesting. Tracy out-snapped Singletary this past week on Singletary's return from injury, but we really need to figure out whether that's because Singletary was coming back from injury or because Tracy has actually taken over this backfield. So that will be really interesting to watch here. I'd be curious your thoughts there. Also, Malik Neighbors was not very good last week in his return from the concussion. I think that one we very much expect to bounce back. And then the George Pickens arrow is to the moon with Russell Wilson. It looks like this was one of my biggest offseason takes, was that when we expected Russell Wilson to be the starter, George Pickens was going to be a huge value because their skill sets match up very well. And we absolutely saw that in their first week together. So between these few interesting storylines and what should be a bad game, what are you watching for? What do you expect?
What should be a bad game? It could be a really exciting game, just low scoring. I don't know.
Yeah, true.
Who knows with this crew? Daniel Jones, etc. Tyrone Tracy, you alluded to it. He outsnapped him. He didn't just outsnap Devin Singletary. He snapped him 67% to 21%. Only out-touched him 9-6. So when Singletary was on the field, they were looking to get him the ball. Tracy ran 29 routes, and Singletary ran only 6. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but coming into this season, at least from my perspective, Singletary was one of the most vulnerable RB1s in the league, like real world RB1s. Like you could easily see him losing his job. Now, it wasn't because Singletary is a bad player. I think he was an interesting target, certainly in the late middle rounds, because his ADP was so low and his touch floor was so high in terms of what we were expecting this backfield to look like. But it did take an injury and some okay play from Singletary prior to the injury to now give Tyrone Tracy an opportunity, and he actually did more with the backfield than Singletary did. So my thinking is that this is more of a, Tracy in the lead role type situation, although, 9-6 is not in the player's first game back is not the type of ratio that gives me 100% confidence that it's going to be Tracy rest of season. I just think that Tracy has played well enough to earn a larger role. And if he's the hotter player in any given game, he's going to see most of the touches. So, and Tracy did get the start. He had 2 carries before Singletary got his first carry, but it wasn't like he got his first 6 carries before Singletary got his first carry. They were working Singletary in pretty quickly, and he's one of the more underrated, or at least underappreciated, running backs of the last few years.
All right, let's get into the positional matchups. We'll be relatively quick on these so we can get to Q&A. At the quarterback position, good matchups. Tua Tagovailoa in his first week back gets the Cardinals, who are 26th in AFPA. They have been very generous to both quarterbacks and receivers. So that's great for that return. Hopefully we see a blow-up game from the guys there. And then Kirk Cousins at the Buccaneers, who are 31st. And a lot of that 31st came from Kirk Cousins earlier this year. And Patrick Mahomes gets the Raiders, who are 24th. Granted, by all expectations, they will be smashing the Raiders. So TBD how much Mahomes has to throw. Are you excited about getting any of these guys into your lineup?
Yeah, Tua and Kirk Cousins were both sneaky starts this week due to the matchups and just their, history of production. And Cousins obviously had that 509 4 touchdown game, 34.4 fantasy points. So you want to get him out there again against the Bucs. The Bucs have given up 271 yards passing and 1.57 touchdowns per game to opposing quarterbacks, with Cousins throwing quite a few of those touchdowns. So yeah, I'm hopeful for Mahomes, but that Vegas game smells like a low scoring game where the Chiefs likely, the defense wins and they only have to score 20 points or something like that. So we'll see.
On the bad side, Kyler Murray gets the Dolphins, who are number 1 in AFPA against quarterbacks. Also, the only other one of kind of interest is Caleb Williams gets the Commanders. That's right. In the bad section, the Commanders are now 8th in AFPA. I'm curious if you have some insights on that, because they were the best matchup for all of last season and seemingly like a month into this season. And then all of a sudden it's massively turned around. So that one's interesting. But then I think the Kyler Murray one is also particularly interesting because he has had the rushing lately to make up for bad passing, but the passing has been atrocious. And he needed like a 50-something yard touchdown run last week to actually be good for you. And Call of Duty Black Ops 6 dropped this weekend. And we know what that does to Kyler Murray. Are you trying to bench him this week if you can? Like, if you've got a streamer?
Well, I'd forgotten about the Call of Duty drop. So that's a little, I mean, I love Kyler and he's got that rushing upside. I think that Miami now will loosen up a little defensively because the offense is going to be better. And so it's not going to have, teams are going to have to throw more against them and maybe have more success from a volume standpoint. They are 26th in yards per attempt allowed. They have allowed the fewest passing yards, 154.5 per game. Only 3 touchdowns allowed, but they also have the fewest attempts allowed.
Yeah.
153. So Arizona probably will try to come out with a lot of James Conner. I'm not like super bullish on Murray this week. If you're worried about with the AFPA, it's understandable, and you might want to find a better matchup or a higher scoring game. With your question about the Commanders, what happened? Well, Baker Mayfield 4 touchdowns in the first game. Daniel Jones 178 and 2 touchdowns in the second game. Joe Burrow 324 and 3 touchdowns in the third game. So immediately they're not up to a great start, just pure numbers wise. And their AFPA is going to look bad for a while. And they just got better. Kyler Murray 142 and 1 allowed. Deshaun Watson 125 and 1 with 4.5 yards per attempt. Lamar Jackson did have a good game against them, but not like a typical Lamar Jackson game. 323 and 1 with 40 yards rushing. That's actually 18.9 fantasy points, which is low for him. So if they're keeping these guys down that are prolific, their AFPA is going to improve because it's adjusted fantasy points allowed. It factors in how these opponents they've played have done against other teams. So their strength of schedule is taken into account, and they've really over the last 3 or 4 weeks shifted into becoming more of a tough matchup, especially after you take Andy Dalton's 93 yards, 2 interception game after he had a few good games, throwing the ball, or at least better than that. So that's how things can change, and that's what we want. We want the metric to be responsive to what's happening on the field, especially in the last few weeks.
Yeah. All right. Running back position. Good matchups. Javonte Williams gets the Panthers, who are dead last in AFPA, and he has been better of late. And then J.K. Dobbins gets the Saints, who are 30th. And J.K. Dobbins has been, this is kind of like the Jared Goff home road split. J.K. Dobbins is unbelievably consistent in his Chargers loss versus wins split, which is not too surprising for a primary running back who's heavily, rush first, not necessarily going to be as involved in passing games, aka when they're trailing. But he has been a stud RB1 in the games they've won and like single-digit fantasy points in the games they've lost. They are favored to beat the Saints by, I think, a touchdown. Obviously, the Saints are in shambles. So, excitement about either of these guys or any other sneaky starts that you like?
Yeah, I did write up Javonte for sneaky starts due to this matchup. He finally found the end zone, and he found it twice last week. And the Panthers are the best matchup AFPA wise for running backs. And Dobbins looks pretty strong. I like your stat there. I mean, I've got him at RB11. He's had kind of a weird little stretch here. I guess he did do fine against Denver, 96 and a touchdown. But last week, 66 total yards against Arizona, I think was disappointing. But in a game that he's favored, especially at home, I would expect him to post low-end RB1 numbers.
On the bad side, Tony Pollard, if you've been relying on him, faces the Lions, who are second in AFPA. All the Bucs RBs that we just talked about a little earlier are facing the Falcons, who are third. That makes that mess of a trio even tougher to start, particularly Irving, as you hit on. White becomes more interesting there because the pass catcher. And then Chase Brown and / Zach Moss get the Eagles, who are seventh, and are also rather confusing on who's the better. Well, I mean, it seems like Chase Brown is the better player, but who's better fantasy play is a little bit complicated there. Are these guys you're trying to sit if you can?
Well, I would say Tony Pollard depends somewhat on Tyjae Spears' status. And last I saw, he was back at practice. If he's back, then I might dig into Pollard's upside a little bit. I don't think Detroit is a team that we have to fear so much as the running back. I mean, they are pretty good against the run, but Aaron Jones had a good game against them a couple weeks ago. So it's not like they are the Ravens or something. And then they do give up pass catches to running backs as well. So Pollard sort of depends on how strong of a start was on Spears. I'm avoiding the Bucs if I can, unless maybe it's a PPR league and you want to start Rachaad White. I mean, I think that's doable. If Bucky Irving sits, then both White and Tucker become somewhat usable. And then for Cincy, Chase Brown it seems official to me, he's taken over. He handled 17 of the 26 backfield touches. last week. And then 29 of the team's 45 backfield touches over the last 2 weeks. This is not a good matchup, though. So it's kind of down to, does he score a touchdown for him to have a big fantasy day? Because he's probably not going to have a big yardage day against Philly. They're 7th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position.
At the wide receiver position, the Falcons wideouts get the Bucks. They were great in the last game. Obviously, you're starting Drake London every week, but maybe this is another Darnell Mooney sneaky flex there. The Packers wide receivers we hit on, they face the Jaguars. That's amazing. So you can probably start more of them than you normally would. And then the Bears wide receiver group gets the Commanders, who still are not great in AFPA against receivers, even though they are against or have gotten better against quarterbacks. And also Calvin Ridley. The Lions are 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So Calvin Ridley in his first game without DeAndre Hopkins, if it's going to happen, it's really got to happen here. If it doesn't happen here, it might be sayonara to Calvin Ridley. How you feeling about these guys?
Yeah, Mason Rudolph at quarterback likely. I think I'd rather see Will Levis at this point, but it is what it is. I wouldn't start Ridley unless I was really desperate at the position, but you underlined a lot of this. I think Mooney I probably should add him to sneaky starts. There's a good point about him as a second or third option there in that passing game, probably delivering. He's been good this year, just had a couple quiet games recently. And then you can start any of the Green Bay receivers. You just might not hit the mole and whack-a-mole necessarily. You might get a quiet game from one of them, but a lot of upside. And DJ Moore, Keenan Allen feels safe. Roma Dunze seems like kind of a high risk, high reward type that it's almost like a Christian Watson situation where they got to hit a bomb touchdown for him to deliver because he's not seeing consistent volume with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, and now Cole Kmet playing pretty well, especially around the end zone. He's like the third or fourth option from Caleb Williams, who's still a rookie quarterback and is not rock solid, consistent passing yardage every week. But this is a good matchup, I think, in general. This will be an interesting game with Mariota at quarterback for Washington.
Should also be interesting to see whether the Falcons spotted something in the Bucks with Darnell Mooney in their first matchup, and or if the Bucks respond to what happened, because when they played each other earlier this year, Mooney had 16 targets, 9 catches, 105 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So if he's anywhere close to that, he's a great start this week, but it'll be curious if they adjust. On the bad side, George Pickens gets the Giants, who are 7th in AFPA. But based off what we saw last week with Russell Wilson, feels like, I don't want to say matchup proof, but he's the one guy there, and Wilson's very happy to chuck it up to him. So I don't know if we're going to be able to bench him anytime soon. Terry McLaurin gets the Bears. They are 4th. You mentioned that being a tough matchup earlier. And if Jayden Daniels is out, Mariota plus a bad matchup makes that one tougher. And then the Cardinals wide receivers get the Dolphins, who we mentioned with the quarterbacks. They are very good against the passing game. The main question here that I wanted to throw out is Marvin Harrison Jr. has not been what we expected, has not even been very good. What's your expectation for him, both in this game and rest of season?
Well, I think, he had the setback with the concussion, and, I was looking at our injury index. The first game back from concussion is usually a 25 to 30% drop in production. So not like too shocking that he didn't have a big game last week. He didn't even sit out a game after his concussion. So he was back in there, 3 for 21, 6 targets. And then there is that footage of him running down the middle of the field wide open, and Kyler Murray didn't see him, which could have changed this entire trajectory. I think in general, you look at his box score, or his game logs, it's not like a giant disappointment. 4 for 130 and 2, 5 for 64 and a touchdown, 5 for 45 and a touchdown in 3 consecutive games. I just think that he and Murray need to get on the same page more consistently, and that probably will come. But we're in like kind of a tough stretch for them too. Like they've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 this week, counting this week and next week, bad matchups AFPA wise, and things don't get better really until after the bye week 12. But then they've got some seriously good matchups where Harrison might be a trade target for you if you are looking to buy perhaps low, because they've got Miami in their second adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers, Chicago 4th. Then they got the Jets, who are 15th, but we think the Jets are probably a little better than that. They just got worked over by George Pickens last week. That hurt their numbers. Then they had the bye to maybe sort things out. Seattle, Minnesota, Seattle, New England, Carolina, a nice run of games where I could see Marvin Harrison having a good stretch there, of fantasy production. So that's sort of where I'm at with him. And then Pickens, you have to look a little deeper sometimes with these matchups. You look at Giants, okay, they're 7th in adjusted fantasy points allowed. But as I mentioned, earlier during the ad read, he will be shadowed by Deonte Banks, who's been bad. 132 passer rating, 131.5 passer rating quarterbacks have had when targeting Banks. And I think he's a shoo-in probably for 60 yards receiving and maybe a touchdown. Maybe you have a bigger game than that even, because it did seem like Wilson was looking for him on the first read on just about every pass play.
All righty. Lastly and briefly, tight ends. Tucker Kraft gets the Jaguars, who are 31st. We hit on that. He's a must start at this point. How many guys are you starting ahead of Tucker Kraft? I'd be curious to know. It has to be less than 6.
Yeah, that's about right. I've got Kraft at 6. So that's exactly correct number. Kittle, Bowers, and Njoku, McBride, and Kelsey right now ranked ahead of Kraft this week. And this is a fantastic matchup against Jacksonville.
Yeah. And then on the flip side of the must-start Tucker Kraft, Dalton Kincaid gets the Seahawks, who are 28th in AFPA, and Dalton Schultz gets the Colts, who are 29th in AFPA. The Daltons here. This feels like a big one for Kincaid because he has been very iffy. With these matchups, are both these guys in your starting range?
Yeah, tight end 14 for Kincaid, but you could make a case for him. He could be 3 or 4 spots higher. It just depends on how you feel about Laporta in a bad matchup with Jameson Williams sidelined. How you feel about Mark Andrews, bad matchup, but has been poking his head up the last couple of weeks, playing better. Cole Kmet playing well. The little bit of a concern with Kincaid now is that Amari Cooper's role is only going to expand. So where does he sit on the target pyramid there? Is he number 2 or is he going to be number 3 behind Khalil Shakir? So that's my only concern there, but it is a nice matchup this week, certainly for Dalton Kincaid and Schultz. It's a good matchup, but he's the third option behind. They want to get Tank Dell going. Stephon Diggs is Stephon Diggs, so he might end up with a 6 for 60 type day, but there's no guarantees when you're the third option. It's just sort of how the chips may fall for you that week.
And Laporta and Andrews are the 2 that I had in the bad matchups. You hit on them. Titans are 1st, Browns are 4th. It's rough there.
Yeah, tight end AFPA is kind of okay. Like, it just sort of depends on their schedule and how things have sort of happened. I wouldn't bench a really good player due to that. But Laporta, as I mentioned, it's really incredible.
Is he a really good player?
Well, I think he led the tight ends in fantasy scoring as a rookie last year. Like, how are we doing this to him?
Right.
Why are the Lions doing this to him and doing it to us? Like, you would expect a guy, really tough position, to come in and do that well as a rookie. And then now he's getting 2 or 3 targets a game versus whatever 6 or 7 that he had last year. So we got to see that usage increase. And I think they're going to have to design some stuff for him unless they just think that Khalif Raymond and Tim Patrick can, pick up all the slack for Jameson Williams. So this is a great week to get at home to get Laporta going, because Goff obviously throws a lot of touchdowns at home. And then, Andrews, we've been waiting on him. I started him last week. I'm happy I did. I had to, but I'm happy I had to. And real talented player, but just sort of seeing his snaps decline from previous seasons and his role decline a little bit in that offense.
Worth noting, it's not like the Lions have struggled with this Laporta plan. They are arguably the best team in the NFC right now after beating the Vikings, and the Vikings losing again to the Rams. So things are working for them in their offense. Makes it even tougher. All right, let's get into the Q&A. We'll try to give it a good chunk here. First of all, thank you for the super sticker, Jay Lizard, who then goes on to ask, what is Pittsburgh going to do about their woeful wide receiver situation? Obviously, they have been involved in trade talks with pretty much every interesting name, or at least they've been connected to those trade talks with every interesting wide receiver name that has popped up, but have not gotten any of them. Not sure if that's their decision, the decisions of teams making the trades. With Russell Wilson back, George Pickens looking like an upside play, do you expect anything to change here?
Well, I think they'll continue to be involved in attempting to trade for a receiver to kind of bolster this group. I mean, Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson, Scott Miller, Roman Wilson has not panned out so far, and they're just basically talking about him like he barely exists right now. He needs to get into practice and to show something before he's going to get into the game. So, this could bode well for Pat Freiermuth over the long term. I mean, we didn't see immediate dividends in Wilson's first start, but if the passing game is more of a 250, 1.5 or 2 touchdown type offense as opposed to 150 and 1, then there's a bigger pie, and somebody like Freiermuth could shine down the stretch. Or maybe the answer is one of these receivers. And Calvin Austin has flashed. I don't think it's Van Jefferson necessarily that's going to step into a legit wide receiver 2 role, but the Steelers are known for drafting really well at receiver, and I've had my eye on Calvin Austin, and hopeful that maybe he can turn into that number 2, 3 option for them. After Freiermuth and Pickens, obviously, but I'm not like betting on it. I think they'll continue to be involved in perhaps trying to trade for somebody that's on the block. But I know they were really interested in Aiyuk, but that ship has sailed. And what are they left with? I mean, Cooper has moved on, Hopkins has moved on. So, who are they down to in terms of trade targets?
It seems like if it'll be someone, it'll be a 2 rather than a 1, but we'll see. AB says, someone offered me Michael Pittman Jr. for Nuke, DeAndre Hopkins. What do you guys think? I will tell you right off the bat, Michael Pittman Jr. has been absolute garbage with Anthony Richardson. It is unbelievable how bad he's been. Single-digit fantasy performances in all of Richardson's full games. This is such an interesting one for me because it's like, at what point does the talent and previous usage of a player in an offense just get thrown out the window because of how bad he's playing this year with this quarterback? To me, I'm taking Hopkins here, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
I have Hopkins ahead, and I went to look because I was ranking or I was projecting the Colts receivers with Richardson. So I pulled, and I don't have it up right now, but I pulled all the, maybe I'll tweet it out later. I pulled all the splits with Richardson, and really the worst player of the Downs, Pittman, Pierce crew been Downs. Pittman's been okay in terms of targets. Now he's not getting a ton of yards. Like Pierce is the one that seems to be getting the bigger yards and some touchdowns and stuff. But Pittman does get a lot of targets. I would take Hopkins now and the upside maybe in this Kansas City offense over Pittman at this point. And that's why I have him ranked 29 for Hopkins and 35 for Pittman. It's just not a pretty passing scene for Anthony Richardson right now.
Yeah. Richardson's got like a sub 50% completion percentage, so you need 14 targets to have a decent day catch-wise with him. Man, it has been rough. Michael Quinzel says, 12-team trade PPR. I have wide receiver depth, and he has running back depth. Should I trade away Dobbins, Diggs, or Metcalf with either Tolbert or Kirk? I assume that's Christian Kirk. For Achane, Shakir, or Deontay Johnson? I would assume that means Achane and Shakir or Deontay Johnson. So it's Dobbins, Diggs, or Metcalf with either Tolbert or Kirk, or Achane and Shakir or Deontay Johnson. That really depends on how good you think Achane's going to be here.
Yeah, so you're reading this. It's Dobbins plus a receiver, either Diggs or Metcalf.
Yeah.
And I would I would go with Metcalf. Because when Nico Collins comes back, I think Metcalf will have higher value than Diggs. And then you're adding another receiver, Tolbert or Kirk. So it's a running back, a receiver, and another receiver for Achane and one of those two receivers. Is that how you're reading it, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. And he's trading away the Dobbins plus receiver side. I don't think you're doing that. Personally.
I don't have a problem with Dobbins, Diggs, and one of those receivers for Achane and Deontay. If you think that Andy Dalton will be back under center quickly, Deontay Johnson's value could fluctuate by about 20 spots rest of season based on who the quarterback is.
Yeah.
If they go back to Bryce Young long term, then he's going to be a wide receiver 4. But if it's Dalton, he's more like a wide receiver 2. And I think Achane plus that is worth it. But and you're trading away, I would keep Metcalf and trade away Diggs. So it would be Dobbins, Diggs plus whoever, I don't know, Tolbert or Kirk. Up to you. I would think about it, but it really depends on that Carolina situation because Achane looks like he could be rest of season RB1 if Miami can stay healthy because he was really productive or was looking like he was going to be very productive with Tua in there.
Feels like the side you have has less question marks. The side you're trading for has more upside. So there's that to consider, really. Jay Lizard with a question specifically for John. No, I'm just kidding. But what is up with Curtis Samuel? My biggest surprise this year. Obviously, we talked a lot about the Bills receivers in the offseason. You were on the Samuel train. I was on the Shakir train. The Shakir train was looking nice. I don't think it's looking that nice anymore or not as nice. Amari Cooper there now, obviously. Do you see any value in Samuel, and do you see much value even in Shakir with Cooper?
No, Curtis Samuel season in Buffalo is over, especially now that Amari Cooper's there. That was definitely a situation where he was a Matt Harmon favorite, and I thought he was headed to a role that would have been bigger. He was reuniting with his offensive coordinator, and they specifically signed him, like went out and signed him to contribute into a receiving core that was pretty bare cupboard when he entered it. And he ended up, I think, getting sidetracked by that injury in the preseason. If you remember, in August, he was out and not part of it. And then they weren't sure if he was going to even play in the first couple of weeks. He was limited, and he's never been able to work his way into a starting level role there. And that is what's up with Curtis Samuel. I don't think it's a talent issue. I think it's not playing time opportunity issue. They had Shakir, who obviously got off to a good start. They definitely wanted to get Keon Coleman out there a lot, and that sort of left not a lot for the injured Samuel early in the season, and then he hasn't been able to establish himself since then. He's definitely droppable at this point.
Yep. Another good question from Jay Lizard, because it is October 25th as we record this. Halloween question. What is the scariest fantasy thing that has happened this year? I mean, I feel like the somewhat easy answer has been the wide receiver injuries because they've been horrible. But if you don't account for injury, I would harken back to Anthony Richardson and what I was talking about earlier. He has been so atrociously bad as a passer and not good enough as a rusher to make up for that in his own fantasy production. So he's, gone from, I think he was the 5th or 6th quarterback drafted in the offseason to maybe fringe QB1 that you can rarely play with any confidence. And then he's also tanked the value of the pass catchers there. And the offense as a whole is not as good as it could be, which means Jonathan Taylor is hurting. So that one has been really rough all across the board. Do you have an answer here, John?
I do, and I feel like we're really coming together as co-hosts because I pulled up the splits for Michael Pittman with Anthony Richardson in the games that he started and finished, and there's 6 of them. Just a couple from last year, and then 4 from this year. 6.8 targets, so 28.5 target share. That's pretty good. 3.8 nice. Catches, 44 yards receiving,
Ooh.
Air yards 74, touchdowns 0.17. So he's averaging in half PPR 7.6 fantasy points per game. PPR 9.5 points per game. That's basically replacement level wide receiver for, like, you need to plug in a guy to get 10 fantasy points in PPR type. We've all done it, trying to find the 5 for 50 guy. That's basically what he's providing at this point. As far as, I think the scariest thing would be to look back and, drafting an Anthony Richardson over. The scariest thing for me is we drafted Patrick Mahomes in the third or fourth round or fifth round, and in FFPC, and could have had Jayden Daniels in the 10th. And Jayden Daniels was my top quarterback target, and I didn't get enough of him because I was seeing some value drop. I always felt like I was going to get my Jayden Daniels, and I wasn't getting him. And I don't know if it was my own publicizing of my love for Jayden Daniels that made it so that I didn't get him. But if you're looking at any draft and you took a quarterback like Dak Prescott, Patrick Mahomes, Anthony Richardson, etc., over Jayden Daniels, and then you look at where Jayden Daniels went in your draft, and you're like, oh, I could have had the QB2, QB3 in the 10th or 11th round, the perfect late round quarterback.
I guess we're back to wait on quarterback strategy, because it felt like we were getting away from it and starting to draft these elite guys, and that has gone out the window this year. Josh Allen has still been very good, so maybe just
Lamar
draft
Jackson.
Josh Allen.
Lamar Jackson's doing great.
Lamar
it's been a little hit or miss with the early round guys, but there's definitely some spooky, scary picks in the first 5 or 6 rounds, to answer your question, Jay Lizard.
All right, one more trade question. We'll close it out with this because we're running a little long, but lots of good questions and lots of good content to get through. So G-Man7, help. This is a trade question. James Conner and Devontae Adams for Devon Achane and Devontae Smith. So Devontae on each side, Conner and Adams for Achane and Smith. Wow. I lean the second half, the Achane half.
I do as well. I just pulled up his rest of season schedule. Arizona this week, which is the toughest matchup he has until week 15 against Houston. 27 Buffalo, 23 Rams, 28 Vegas, 31 New England, 18 Green Bay, and 15 Jets. This offense should take off. He's going to be a huge part of it. James Conner has been very productive. I think Devontae Adams has some upside in that Jets offense, but I don't think things everything that's gone with the Jets just doesn't work out as they've expected.
Nope.
So we're all sort of like, oh, Aaron Rodgers, cool. Garrett Wilson's going to explode. Well, he hasn't really exploded. Breece Hall's going to be consistent. Yeah, well, recently Breece Hall's been better because they're giving him bell cow touches. But I don't know that Devontae Adams is going to come back and be Devontae Adams 3-4 years ago, or Rodgers is, that connection is going to be that great that quickly. So I lean Achane, Devontae, I think.
It feels like Adams, you're really kind of hoping that he basically is Devontae Smith, more or less, which is like a rotating 1A, 1B with a really good other player, other receiver. And then Achane, Connor's as reliable as it gets, but Achane's upside is massive. I think you mentioned could be RB1, the RB1 rest of the season, especially with that schedule. So
I will note that Connor does have a pretty favorable playoff schedule. He's got Seattle in week 14, New England 31st in week 15, and then Carolina in the championship game in week 16. So it is tough to trade that away. We're not much help.
No. I still think I would do it, but that's good players on both sides. You know what? That's how trades are supposed to work. That should be mutually beneficial. All right. We'll close it up there. Big pod this week. Lots of stuff to talk about. We're halfway into the season pretty much, especially into the fantasy season. So things are going to get tougher down the stretch. Any closing thoughts as we head into week 8?
Yeah. Just if you didn't get your question answered, I do answer all questions, even start sit, even though I don't like to, in my weekly Friday chat. Get in there early. I limit myself to about an hour max, especially if it's just me reading the rankings to you. But you need to be a 444 subscriber. Get into the Discord at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern today. Ask your question there. We can't get to them all here with these questions because we're talking about so much. We're giving you so much information, news, thoughts on situations all around the league that we don't have time to answer everybody's question. I'm sorry about that, but I do a chat. So join it.
One of many extremely beneficial upsides of getting the 444 subscription, including checking out my waiver wire column on Monday morning. So I'll see you there in that if you subscribe, which you should. John will see you today in the Discord if you're there. And we will both see you next week on the Most Accurate Podcast. Good luck. May you all win, unless you're playing each other, because then only one of you can win. Adios.